Reading 33 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Maurice Nicoll. Volume 2. Berlip, August 12, 1944. Levels of Consciousness. Let us study the law of seven, or the law of octaves, tonight. As you know, the supreme example is the ray of creation, which shows how there are different levels or notes, do, si, la, etc., descending to re, which represents in our case the smallest, most undeveloped part, the moon. According to the law of octaves, the notes of the descending octave involve more and more laws and vice versa. A part is under more laws than the whole. The moon is under 96 laws or orders of laws, the earth under 48 laws, and the summit, do, the absolute, is under no laws save the laws of its own unity. From this it is seen that the lower down anything stands in the octave, the more laws it is under. The will of the absolute does not reach us directly, but in the form of 48 orders of laws, which produce for us in their varying combinations the conditions of our life. Now, any organization or organism is built according to the law of 3 and law of 7, in the same way as the whole universe, which is a vast organism. Let us take organic life, which is an organism spread like a thin film over the earth to receive and transmit influences from the sun and galaxies. Man is an organism within organic life. He is a minute part, a minute cell in the body of organic life, comparable to a brain cell in his own body. Let us construct an octave between organic life and man. Once Mr. Ouspensky asked us to think about this, and at the same time he himself constructed the octave as follows. Mr. Ouspensky said that we should think in terms of the law of octaves about the present situation of man on earth. This was some time before the present war started. He said that if we would study the octave as he had constructed it, we would see that at the place of shock between the notes mi and fa, something was necessary to make ascending force pass from a national consciousness to a European consciousness. Man, as do, had reached the patriarchal or family system, re, and later he had reached the consciousness of the note mi, national consciousness. An Englishman, for example, feels himself as an individual. He feels himself as family, and he feels himself as nation. He sounds, as it were, 3 notes, do, re, mi, but he does not feel Europe. He does not sound the note fa. He is not conscious at this level. In this respect, it is as if people came up against an obstacle, against something that requires a shock for them to get past. Everyone will agree that at the level of consciousness belonging to the note re, the organism, which we can call roughly the family, it would be absurd for them to lock themselves up in their houses and try to throw bombs at each other. Everyone would know it was ridiculous. In the same way, all European war is equally ridiculous and equally criminal. The Franco-Prussian War in the 70s of the last century was a criminal war quite different from earlier wars when there were few means of communication. Europe is like a house full of flats. For one flat to make war on another flat is criminal, and is really liable to destroy the whole block of flats, For just as man himself is an organism, and a family or class is an organism, and a nation is an organism, so should Europe now become an organism, especially with the development of methods of communication that has taken place within the last 100 years. These have increased the power of governments, as is quite obvious. And if government is bad, then the situation is very bad, far worse than it used to be before Europe had the possibility of becoming an organism. There is no nation in Europe that can live without another nation, just as there is no organ in a man's body that can exist without the other organs. Now, all evolution is an ascent of an octave. Psychological evolution is an increase of consciousness, a bringing together of more things into a unity, because consciousness means a knowing together. In the same way, an evolution of the emotions is a bringing together of many different feelings, and this makes conscience. And the two, this knowing together and this feeling together, are the lines of psychological evolution both for man himself and for humanity. So you see that one explanation of the present situation in this century, which should have seen a definite step forward, is due to a lack of development in consciousness beyond the national level, beyond the note me in the constructed octave between organic life and man. Now notice that a man, a single individual, must first of all belong to a group of some kind, which in turn is connected with a larger organization. The more one studies the law of seven, the more one sees that it is a uniting framework, a skeleton, as it were, for all forms of life, psychological or physical. Everything is united, everything is connected together. Nothing can exist independently. Yet each thing has its own individual existence, although it is connected with what is below it and what is above it. You remember that Mr. Ouspensky used often to dwell on this point, that everything is connected and that nothing is separate. He used to say that people's consciousness was so poorly developed in this respect that they did not even realize that all our food came from the sun. Sometimes he used to say that the object of this work is to increase consciousness. It is not, he said, based on faith or hope or love, although all these are included. What is emphasized is consciousness. He said that G was constantly speaking about this necessity for the development of consciousness, and that he used to compare the inner working of man's being with complex machines working practically in the dark. The first development of consciousness is to become conscious of personality and of the many different I's that compose it, some useful and some useless. This is a definite development of consciousness, and from this step it is possible to develop consciousness still further by becoming conscious of another person. But without being far more conscious of oneself, one cannot become conscious of another person, save in an illusory way, in imagination. We have, first of all, to be able to bear ourselves before we can bear others. Now, these developments of consciousness are exactly comparable to the developments shown in the octave between organic life and man. Each step seems an increase of consciousness. In the case of an individual, self-study, carried out on the right lines, leads to a new note being sounded in him. We need not discuss which note, but with the beginning of the sounding of this note, he will experience quite new sensations of himself and quite new feelings. He will become unfamiliar to himself, and if he does not know what is happening, he may think that something is going in a wrong direction. But if you begin to leave the room in which you have always sat, you will necessarily find yourself in new situations. Now, just imagine what would happen if there were a development of European consciousness, and the whole of Europe were drawn together into a new organism. We would, of course, experience quite new sensations and feelings. We would no longer pride ourselves in the same ways or be connected as we were before. So there would appear to be a loss of something which we apparently regard as very important. But it is precisely this loss of something that will enable a new note to sound in one's individual psychological evolution. There must be a loss of something for a new note to sound, as all the forms of vanity and most forms of pride must change, must cease to give us their various secret satisfactions, as they have hitherto done. At the same time, the conditions under which a new note sounds in the octave of one's own development will necessitate an increase of consciousness in regard to knowing and feeling more together. If we could know everything, our present feeling of ourselves would completely change. Fortunately, we cannot do this because, as you know, we would go mad, because we would become aware of all the contradictions in our lives. In order that we should not see these contradictions, an appliance called buffers is introduced at an early age with the inevitable result of narrowing of consciousness. So you see that an increase of consciousness implies ultimately a weakening of buffers, and I think the same parallel can be drawn in connection with an increase of consciousness in the other octave. For each nation to be at the level of Europe, many national buffers would have to disappear. I will add a few words in this connection about will, of which we have been speaking recently. You will remember that real will is not exactly making decisions or negations, but consists in finding solutions. For this reason, with our limited consciousness, we can scarcely expect to have real will. In order to do so, we must be able to be conscious of a number of things together and not merely one at a time. With our narrow consciousness, we see one thing and then another and then a third, and we cannot see any connection between them, and they seem to us to be opposites, and so mutually irreconcilable. You remember the Eastern story of the sages who had to examine an elephant in the dark. One felt the tail, and another felt the trunk, and another the ear, and so on, and at the end each gave an entirely different description to the caliph. Our situation is somewhat like that. If we could see the whole elephant, we could give it orders, and we would understand that all its different parts were. But as it is, we see little bits at a time, and we try to make aim and have will about these little bits without seeing their connection with the whole. But even as we are, we can have small aim and believe we have will to keep it. But the supreme aim, without which we can never reach master or real I, is the work and all that it means. This, as you know, is phrased in the Gospels. Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. How can we really expect, save for purposes of experiment and observation, to get any result from making aims based on self-will? And how can we expect that in this way our consciousness will be able to increase beyond its present level? The whole idea of will must become intelligent. You may have to sail north and south and even east at times in order to cross the Atlantic. But if you have got some real self-observation, and if you have sounded the dough of the work strongly enough, and if above all you feel that you cannot lose hold of this work, then, although you may find that you have often to go in apparently contradictory ways, which are often very confusing, yet something will give you a kind of feeling when you are really going in the wrong way, but it will never tell you when you are going in the right way. As you know in the parable of the horse, carriage, and driver, when the driver is on the box and has the reins, he must start as best he can, and then the master may be found sitting in the carriage and may say something. Remember that real will, or master, comes down from a higher level and cannot reach the ordinary so-called waking state of consciousness. Something must be awake in one to have any contact, and that means that there must be some state of self-remembering present. After a time, one can begin to tell when one is asleep inside, when there is no kind of self-remembering taking place. It is said sometimes when you are in difficulties that the work will find a way for you. Yes, this is so, but only when you feel the work and value it. It must be in you, not merely something outside you. When you have affection for something, when you value something, it is in you. The master can speak through the work, and the work can speak to us. But the master cannot speak to us directly.